Hello, this is Julian with Coffea Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Sidra CCX washed, macerated, processed Ecuador from Coffea Circulor. And there's the bag right there. And Coffea Circulor, based out of Gothenburg, Sweden. And this is the second of 4 Gala Morales Coffea Circulor coffees we'll be featuring over the next several weeks. This one is also the only non-traditional wash-processed coffee we're going to be reviewing in this series. So I'm glad we got an opportunity to discuss at least one slightly more processed coffee from Gala Morales. And we'll see how this one turned out. This right here is day 39. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Coffea Circular's recipe for the V60, but with the Chemex, which is a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. Even with the additional processing that was present within this one, you can definitely still tell that it is on the lighter side of that spectrum, as this one is still considered a very light coffee by most standards and metrics. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the cup had an expected level of intensity with a fair bit of expected citrus, as well as strong honeyed sweetness to the cup. In addition to that, the brightness was instantaneously noticed with a long-lasting slight citric bitterness to the cup. Overall, a pretty solid start. I think the first thing I took away from it was the clarity, as it did turn out a little bit more clean than I might have expected going into it, given the slight processing to it. But we continue on to day 17 as we ran into the Chemex, and there was already improvement as there was a little bit more depth to the cup, as it was a slightly bitter honey and citric forward cup with a little bit more of the listed stone fruits also present. Relatively clean, as once again, I could not help but note the clarity of this one. So another pretty solid day for this coffee. We continue on to day 20, opted for the April brewer, and the continued clarity seems to be the most noteworthy factor of the cup itself, as it's lacking many of the expected fermenty aspects in place of a cleaner red fruit feel. And looking back on it, I wondered, okay, there's a red fruit component to it, and I was thinking that that's traditionally a little bit more associated with heavier processed coffees. And I looked on the bag and I saw the pomegranate, and I said, okay, well, they also account for the slight red fruit that's present within this one. I actually looked before this review and said there was a red fruit in this coffee, and as I'm drinking it right now, there's a red fruit. And then once again, I found that there was a pomegranate, which did feel very apt for this coffee, as it offered that honeyed and classic Coffea Circulor bergamot aspect within it. Stone fruits open up a lot more as it cools down, so definitely some pretty nice depth to this one. We continue on to day 22 as we opted for the V60 with Coffea Circular's recipe. And interestingly enough, the cup is the best it has been up to this point by a distance, as it's offering a significantly better amount of balance with a more even cup in terms of the citrus as well as peach at the forefront, before settling into a more sweeter, ripe stone fruit aspect. Fermentiness is notably toned down, as it hasn't necessarily been an overly abundant component to this one, and it's much more aligned with a fruit sweetness, still intense, but in a much more even sense. So I was really enjoying this day. Very nice day on this mark. We continue on to day 25 as we opted for the Chemex with Coffea Circular's recipe, and I could not help but note that it remains surprisingly clean, a lot cleaner than expected going into it, as there's a slight candied sweetness and a stone fruit sense with plenty of the lingering honeyed sweetness as well. Might actually be the best day of the coffee so far, as it continues to skew on the fruit and floral sweetness direction. A very nice day on this one. So we continue on to day 28 as we opted for the V60 with Coffea Circular's recipe. And interestingly enough, it was not quite as impressive as that day 22 mark, so I felt like there was a slight bit of inconsistency, at least in terms of the V60. As this one skewed a little bit more on the citric side of things, with the lemon being the most pronounced component to it. There was plenty of improvement on the cool down, as it does continue to offer a lot of the honey and peachy aspects of it, and it's a much more pronounced component with still some very nice clarity. Continue on to day 31 as we opted for the Chemex with Coffea Circular's recipe, and this confirmed my preference towards the Chemex with this one, as it continues to remain relatively clean with plenty of the citric honey attributes, a slight red fruit component. Once again, looking back on it, pomegranate makes a lot of sense, an herbal component, and an overall solid day. Day 34, final notes we have, and I found consistency towards the end as it offers a citric floral forward profile with plenty of the honeyed florality being one of the more defining factors. Brightness at an interestingly medium to high level with a delicate bodied cup and plenty of the stone fruit aspects. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s. Let's go through those real quick. And we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. I feel like it's only apt that we do start in terms of the clarity for this one, as this one was definitely a fair bit cleaner than I might have expected going into it. Now, I don't review too many wash macerated processed coffees on this channel, and I think that is maybe one of the reasons why I'm a little bit more surprised by it. I've said before that at least when you put the washed term near the processing, then oftentimes it can come out a little bit more clean than you might expect. I've had plenty of anaerobic wash processed coffees that turned out significantly cleaner than I expected. This one right here, I had no idea what to make of it going into it, especially given that it is an Ecuadorian coffee. And truth be told, I've had some pretty bad luck with heavier processed Ecuadorian coffees in general. So the level 4 clarity is a very nice start for this one, as I could not necessarily knock it for anything. Maybe an ever so slight fermentiness, but even then the graining quality, that was something maybe a little bit more expected given that it is a slightly more processed coffee and a Sidra coffee. Fully expected that, not really present. Level 4 seems perfectly fitting. It's a true level 4 nonetheless. Finish, level 4 also has a pretty even finish to it, so I don't necessarily have too much to add to that. At times it could skew a little bit more in terms of the citric direction, sometimes in terms of the floral direction, and at its best in terms of the stone fruit direction. So definitely a multitude of potential finishes for this one. Sweetness, level 4. And this one was, I would say, about as sweet as I expected. Going into it, I said that might be the big key and factor for this one, is just how high the sweetness scores. Though truth be told, when it comes to Sidra coffees, I don't necessarily consider them to be on the sweeter side of things, but this one offered it in a multitude of directions, and it even had a slight bit of a candied feel to it at times. So that level 4 mark felt like the perfect place to put that. Florality, level 4. Yeah, and I mentioned that there was a little bit of a citric floral component to it, but in addition to that honeyed floral component. So once again, level 4 seems like one of the more defining factors, right there in line with the citrus fruit that was also there at the level 4. As I mentioned, a little bit of a citric florality, and typically my most common experiences with citric coffees is that they skew a little bit more on the citric side of things in general. So that was probably the most expected attribute of this coffee. Then we'll go through the level 3s real quick, and we'll start with the acidity, level 3. First impression, I noticed the brightness. It's one of those things where it's just noticeable. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's overly high, and for me it finished at a 3.5, and I said, I don't know if I can necessarily push this up to a 4, given I was reviewing this coffee alongside of the Cramo, and the Cramo had a fair bit more brightness to it. I said, okay, we'll keep this down at a 3, even though truth be told, it could probably go in either of those two categories. Grapefruit, level 3. The pomegranate, which at times I felt like could have been a little bit more heavy given certain aspects of this coffee. Right there at the level 3, it's good. It shows that it's present, you can feel it, but at the same time, it's not something that's going to hinder the cup altogether. Stone fruit, level 3. I wish I could have gotten that up to a level 4 at times. When I was experiencing that in abundance, it was the best part of this coffee for me. That's not surprising. Stone fruit usually is when I get a fair bit of it. So level 3 felt like a good place to put that. And then only one other thing really worth discussing, and that's the body at the level 2. As this one right here also seems to offer a little less body. Could have been the Chemex at play, as this tasting wheel was made with the Chemex, so things toned down ever so slightly in terms of the overall texture for this coffee. But as I am looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, let me just start with this. As far as wash macerated processed coffees go, I feel like this is probably the best one I've ever had. I can't really think of many I've had in the past, and I can't think of any that I've actually liked in the past. So I could be wrong, but as far as this one goes, it definitely exceeded all of the expectations I had going into it, which is to say, my expectations for this one are kind of moderate. I'm not the biggest fan of anything that is a little bit more processed in addition to the wash term. And I'm also not necessarily the biggest fan of Sidra coffees, so I was just kind of looking at this and saying, I don't know, we'll add it to the series since it is a coffee that Coffea Circulor and Gala Morales are working on together, and it seemed like there were a fair bit of things that could go very right with this one, and that's what happened, honestly, is I've just turned out to enjoy it a lot more than I might have expected, and I'm not necessarily saying that this is a world beater. It's going to be one of my favorite coffees at the end of the year. I would say that it just turned out to be a coffee that I very much enjoyed from start to finish, though it's not something that I'm necessarily going to remember a year down the line. type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like if you have liked your Sidra coffees in the past, then this one is a very good one for you because it offers plenty of the clarity that you might expect for it while also being on the sweeter side of those Sidra coffees, and still going to offer plenty of those classic citric components to it, as the citrus scoring there at the level 4, also getting a little bit of those bergamot-like attributes that are kind of classic with Coffea Circular's coffees. Does give it some just classic traditionality in terms of the Sidra variety. In addition to that, you are getting a fair bit of the peachy aspects to it and plenty of florality while still keeping some very nice clarity in general. So that's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you enjoyed the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Sidra CCX wash macerated processed Ecuador from Coffea Circulor. Thank you for watching.